The next facet of enabling hunting in your organization that I think we need to talk about is maybe one of the most important, and that's the data and tools you use within your network to support your threat hunting. And I'll be honest, when I go into an organization and I'm evaluating what their threat hunting capability is, one of the clearest ways to do so is to ask them what data sources they have available. And I don't just ask one person, I asked everybody who's involved with threat hunting. And what I'm looking for is, first of all, a diversity of data sources. I'm looking for specific data sources that I think are critical to the function and the role. And I'm also looking for consistency of answers. That way I know everyone understands what data sources are available, understands the value they provide, and they all have equal and easy access to them. So those are the things I'm looking for here, and that's what we're going to talk about, both in terms of data and tools, but we'll start with data. Now, picking the data you need is a pretty broad topic, and it really depends on your threat model and the makeup of your network that's going to drive what you need to some degree. Now, I say to some degree because there are some data sources that I think are mostly universal, and I'm going to talk about and describe some of those as well. Now, you may say, well, isn't the data I need for hunting the same data that I need for typical IDS alert-driven investigations? And in many cases, that may actually be the truth. You may actually just need the same data, and it's just that hunters are going to interact with it in different ways. So hunters may access the same data with different tool sets. That's something we see a lot of, but there are some data sources that lean themselves more towards effective hunting rather than just effective alert-based investigations. So what I want to do here for the next little bit, we'll focus on data first, and I'm just going to describe some different maturity levels I see amongst organizations based upon individual data types. So I don't want to spend too much time justifying the need for these individual data types. I feel like we're doing that kind of passively throughout the course, and there is a lot of documentation to find on that elsewhere, and I'll provide some of that to you as well. I want to be a little bit more no nonsense here. So I'm going to take a focus based upon the 5 realms of evidence: network, disk, friendly intel, threat intel, and memory. And I'm basically going to tell you what data sources I think are required based upon your maturity level. So we'll start with what I think the bare minimum data sources are, and then we'll move up kind of to intermediate and advanced organizations. And again, talking about the different classes of data that I think you absolutely have to have, and then the ones I think you need as you progress to kind of give you those bare minimums and some goalposts that you can kind of aim for. So let's get into it. Now, I've already mentioned that you don't need a lot to get started hunting. Matter of fact, I started off this course by listing a few simple queries you could run and questions you could ask to begin hunting with individual data sources. So in many cases, you really just need one data source to start hunting. So that's really what I'm going to talk about as the bare minimum, but I'm going to really just give you one in each of the realms that I talked about for the most part. The key here is you don't need a lot to get started, but here's what I believe to be the bare minimum to be effective at threat hunting and have enough that you can sink your teeth into, both from an attack-based perspective and a database perspective. On the network side, I think you need some type of authoritative source of network communication data. In some organizations, that's going to be flow data, either generated by a third-party flow collector or your existing routing infrastructure, which will often generate that flow data for you and be collected in a central location. And alternatively, you may get firewall data instead. Many of you may find that easier to collect. But what you're looking for is some authoritative source of network connection information. I'm looking for what IP address talk to what other IP address, when, and for how long. The very most basic of network data. Not a lot of context, but incredibly useful if you just start there. Now, on the disk side, there are really 2 things I think you need. The first is just simple operating system logs. For most of us, that's probably going to be Windows logs. And for some of us, it may be Linux or Mac logs or what have you. Maybe some embedded devices if you want to get fancy. But just starting out with basic OS logs from servers and endpoints and having some type of access to them. We'll talk about tools in a little while and the notion of centralized access. But even just having the ability to go out and grab those logs yourself is something. To be able to grab them from several hosts, pull them back, and run some attack-based or database hunting. Kind of similar to that is the notion of disk access, just the ability to go in and access the disk of a system and grab not only files, but things like the registry, sensitive system files, currently running processes, being able to interact with the tools that are on the system to interrogate the system itself. Those things are important. So having easy access to get to the live disk of these different devices. I'm not talking about dead disk access here. I'm not talking about going out and pulling the disk from the machine and running cold disk forensics. I'm talking about actually live disk access to the files on that system, so you can run threat hunting queries across not just one host, but multiple hosts, and we'll talk about tools again here in a moment. So that's the disk category. Now, on the threat intel side, at bare minimum, you need access to reputation data, and the good thing is there are a lot of free reputation data sources out there available for us. Things like IP void or URL void, things like a virus total, something like that. Just a way to go in and take an IP address, a domain name, a file hash, drop those into a list and see if there is any history of them having been reported hosting malicious content or being involved in malicious activity. Finally, on the friendly intel side, the more the barrier here, the more you can start out with, the better, of course, but at a bare minimum, you need the ability to look up user details. You need to understand what the role of a user is. If you see a user that's running some weird IT admin tool, you need to know if they're actually in IT or they're in finance or HR. You need to know if the action is expected for the user, because we spend so much of our time in hunting looking at deviations from baseline, and the role of the user is a pretty standard baseline. In addition to that, you need a basic understanding of what the standard applications on your network are. If you have a very small network, this may be pretty easy. If you have a very large network, this may be hard, and you may have to divide this out by role or function, but it is doable. You need to know what the standard apps on your gold disk or gold image are, and then what are the standard apps that are run in finance, HR, development, admin, secretarial, etc. Just having a basic list of these things is useful, so that, again, when you start looking at deviations from the norm, particularly as it relates to program executions, you can compare against this list of standard apps. So that's it. You notice memory is not listed here. That was one of the other 5 realms of evidence. That's because we're not really getting into memory forensics at the bare minimum hunting level. But I do think if you want to be effective at hunting, you need at least these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 data sources here. I'm not saying you can't find some things with just one of these, but I think this is the bare minimum for an organization to say they are doing some form of operational threat hunting. As you progress from the bare minimum into a more basic level of hunting, you'll see that you start to add things to your environment that add more context-rich data sources. And we see all of the same things from the previous slide on here with the addition of a few extra things. One of those on the network side is the addition of something like Bro or Zeek logs, obviously formerly known as Bro, now called Zeek, gives you a slimmed down version of a packet capture. So a more robust version of a flow or firewall log, right? It's something that sits in the middle and provides a nice, easy balance and provides a lot of great value for hunting with all of those additional network traffic details. So that's a good place to go from the network side. On the disk side, the thing we really want to see people start pushing towards at the basic level is application server authentication logs. And we say this because application servers are wide and varied. You may have a number of different application servers within your organization, and maybe you're even using cloud-based ones. But you need those application server logs because that, in most cases, is where business actually happens. It's where a lot of your sensitive data is stored, and you need to start collecting those so you can perform hunting across those different logs. I don't necessarily think that's a bare minimum requirement because they are so diverse and varied, and it's hard to parse and normalize and get all those into the same place. But very quickly, that's where I want to see organizations moving toward the basic level, is bringing in the bulk of the sensitive application security authentication logs. Now, I don't have anything new to add to the threat intel section at the basic level, but at the friendly intel level, you do notice I've added, in this case, asset roles. We had user details and standard apps, now concerned with asset roles. So I basically want to be able to interrogate and say, okay, I have an IP address or a host name from a system on my network, and I want to know what its job is here. What would you say it is you do here? Is it a workstation or is it a server? That's probably the basic thing I want to know. Workstation, server, networking hardware, printer, something like that. Then I want to be able to go a little bit deeper. What kind of server is it? What is it supposed to do? Ideally, I can look that up in a list, an asset inventory type thing, and it's all there programmatically for me. Worst case scenario, I want to be able to have a phone number I can call and say, hey, what does this server do? Probably because I'm doing some hunting through it and I'm finding something weird or anomalous about it, and I want to know if this is normal for that server or if it's something that's deviating from baseline. So this is where we're getting to at the basic level. Not a huge jump at this point in terms of effort in many cases, but a massive jump in terms of value as it relates to sensitive data and how it moves around the network. As we continue to progress to an intermediate stage, we start to really expand coverage in terms of pathways into and out of the network beyond the traditional perimeter focused things. So in this case, we were originally focused on flow and firewall data, things going into and out of the network from just a general network sense. But now on the network side, we're focused in a couple different areas. One of those is VPN access, which is something a lot of people don't think of, but the VPN is essentially an authenticated method for someone outside your network to gain access inside your network. So when we think about things like credential theft, if we're thinking about attack-based hunting, a lot of the times it's going to manifest within VPN access. So this is a log I want to see people getting access to and aggregating and centralizing at the intermediate level. Beyond that, on the network side, this is where I really expect people to have PCAP. Most people are surprised at this. Most people would say that they expect PCAP to be table stakes, something you need at the very intermediate level. But I wouldn't necessarily go that far exclusively for hunting. I might say, yes, that is the case for typical alert-based investigations, but not necessarily for hunting. I'd rather see flow or firewall logs and Zeek logs before we start worrying about PCAP, and PCAP is a lot more difficult to collect and store, so that's why it is something I don't necessarily expect to see until this intermediate level. Now, on the disk side, another pathway into our network, and probably one of the biggest sources of attacks that many of us will see, are emails, right? Links in emails or attachments in emails. So at this point, we're looking for mail transaction logs, because those are going to tell us what mail was sent from whom and to where, and essentially who mounted that mailbox or who opened it. So we can ideally see attackers who maybe have stolen some credentials, who are mounting potentially compromised mail accounts, but we can also start to see the receipt of malicious emails, track down phishing. Hunting for phishing is kind of its own separate beast. There's just a lot of ways to go about it because there's a lot of opportunity for anomalies to manifest themselves, as we've talked about. But it is important, and really at this level is where I start to see more of that going on. Sometimes made a little bit easier if you're using cloud-based email with robust logs you can centralize. Maybe a little bit harder if it's your own mail infrastructure and you're having to move those logs around. From the threat intel perspective, this is where we start to see people really getting into passive DNS, and there are certainly free resources for passive DNS out there, but there are also paid ones that are a little bit better with a little bit more expanded infrastructure in terms of the amount of queries you can run and the interfaces you can use. But this is where we start to see hunters find related infrastructure. And you're not just hunting through your own data, but you're actually hunting through attacker infrastructure, such that you found a domain name that an attacker owns. So now you can look at all of the IP addresses that have ever resolved to it and start trying to figure out whether those were controlled by the attacker. And now let's pivot from each one of those to other domains that have pointed to them, which may also have been owned by an attacker if they were pointing to common shared IP infrastructure. So this is where we see a lot of attacker infrastructure things starting to happen. I'm not going to say it's necessarily at an advanced state, but the organizations who are really starting to become concerned with more sophisticated threat intel, particularly as it relates to their organization. So a lot of, obviously, defense, big organizations with a lot of secrets to protect, like pharmaceuticals or farming agriculture type places, various defense contractors, and so on. We see a lot more passive DNS being utilized to research attacker infrastructure. So nothing new with friendly intel, but this does make up the scope of what I expect to see in the intermediate threat hunting organization. This finally brings us to the advanced organization, the organization that really has a robust threat hunting capability that has fully considered all of the data sources available to them, and particularly all the different manifestations of attacks that can exist on the network. So these are folks who are thinking, first of all, beyond the traditional network perimeter, even more so than we've already talked about. So on the network side, we consider cloud access logs. So how much of your organization is using something like AWS or Office 365 or Google Cloud? And how much time have you spent thinking about the logs that represent access to those resources? That is essentially an extension of your network that sits outside of your network. So that's something to consider, and hunting through those logs can be quite valuable. They're often a little trickier to get, especially if you're using multiple cloud providers. You have to build new infrastructure and parsers for each of them, particularly in terms of network traffic versus basically just the disk-based or access-based stuff. But that can be a little bit trickier, but we do have to consider, and that is something I expect of advanced organizations. Similarly, we have other forms of kind of non-traditional computing. One of those are containers, things like Docker logs. Many of us are still blind to the things that are happening within Docker containers within our systems because those are logged differently or logged inside the container itself, and we're not yet maybe shipping those log outside. So we have to treat those maybe not exactly like traditional systems, but we have to, in some facets, think of them that way and look for anomalies considering that too. Not just merely the presence of those containers, but also the fact that we have things going on inside of them that are invisible to us. We also, in the same vein, have things like BYOD, bring your own device, right? This is particularly a problem in retail organizations where you provide public Wi-Fi. And certainly we want to think that that public Wi-Fi is secure and nobody can bridge the gap between that and our private network, but obviously that type of thing can happen and does happen in some places. And we also have to consider the legal side of this, that sometimes you're responsible for the things that are going on your public wireless network, even if it's not posing a threat to your sensitive data inside your own network. So we have to concern ourselves with that, and as such, we may want to collect certain passive data there. Again, I'm not a lawyer in this case, so it depends on your function, but that's something we should consider, as well as things like the Internet of Things, IP-enabled devices that maybe we wouldn't expect. Things like thermostats, robotic vacuums, robotic toasters. I've not seen a lot of robotic toasters, but I'm almost certain one probably exists. So collecting logs from those things is often very difficult because a lot of them don't log very well and they have their own custom mechanisms, and it's really it's really not till the advanced level that I see most of those logs being collected, just because of the sheer nature of the work that goes along with it. From the intel side, on threat intel side, this is where we see folks really getting into specific threat profiles, and we're talking about collecting data related to threat actors, specifically targeting your institution. So maybe targeting financial institutions or pharmaceuticals or so on, actually having an internal threat capability to do this. Most organizations will never have this. Most organizations will subscribe to informational feeds from places like a Mandiant or a CrowdStrike or something like that, or maybe they're in some type of group that's some type of partner organization, like a group of financial companies that all share intel, something of that nature. But for very large organizations with certain threat profiles, they will collect this type of data, and that does inform the threat intel based hunting that's going on. On the friendly intel side, we're really talking more about user behaviors here, more advanced versions of user behaviors and programmatic systems, which will capture and analyze those. Most of these are commercial solutions, but that's something we see at this level. And finally, you see the fifth realm of evidence here, memory, hunting through memory images. I'm not saying that it isn't nice to have this ability at the basic or intermediate level. Certainly it is, but it's usually not to the advanced level that I'm seeing most people doing any type of meaningful threat hunting through it. One, because it's difficult to collect and pull in lots of memory images at scale because they're so large and it often requires commercial software to do it. And two, the skill level just isn't there in the community yet. This is still relatively new as a data mining resource, so we're not seeing quite as many people skilled in the ability to hunt through it yet, although that is certainly changing as we go along. So these are my recommendations. Again, I told you this lesson was going to be a little no nonsense, and that I'm not going to try to justify all of these to you, but I'm telling you what my recommendations are based upon what I've seen and what I think is realistic for organizations to shoot for. This is going to vary a little bit in your organization with your specific threat profile. I can't tell you every data source you're going to need, but this is just to set some broad goalposts for you to shoot for as you're figuring out what I need in my network to really enable the hunting function. The last thing I'll mention in this video is the notion of the hunting analysis tools that I think are really required to enable that process. And I know this is something a lot of people have been waiting for, is for me to tell them what tools I think they need. And I promise I'm not going to disappoint, but I tell you what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to just sit here in this video and just read you out loud a list of the tools that I think are valuable. I don't think that's necessarily the best use of your time. So what I am going to do is just list the three really major categories of hunting analysis tools that I think exist. And then I'm going to link you to a PDF that I've provided with basically Chris's recommendation of the best of breed tools. I'm not going to give you all of the tools available. I'm going to give you the ones I think are the best because I think that's what you're paying for in this course, is to get my perspective on what I've seen that works really well based upon my experience and the experience of others. So you will find that in the attached PDF. Now, with that said, I do break these things out into a couple of categories I do want to explain. The first is the log aggregator. And in this case, I do have just a bunch of random log aggregators listed here, and you may recognize some of these things. We have things like ELK, which is free and open source, and we teach a course on it. You have Graylog, which is based on ELK, and there is a free version, but there is also a commercial version. You have big commercial solutions too, like Splunk, another log aggregator, or Logly. You also have tools for which log aggregation is a function they provide while also providing other functions. So things like SIEMs. And that's what we see with QRadar, Logarithm, and ArcSide. They call themselves SIEMs because they have multiple functions rolled in and not just log aggregation. Now, I'll add, that doesn't mean they're better. That just means they do some other things. And sometimes that means they are worse at doing the thing you want them to do because they're spending so much time trying to meet too many use cases. And I certainly think that's the case with a certain number of those, which I'll talk about a little bit in the PDF that I've linked for you. So the key thing here is keep log aggregation as a separate thing in your mind from SIEM. SIEM may include log aggregation, but log aggregation in itself is separate. And that means simply the ability to centralize your logs and, generally speaking, provide some way to access them, provide some analysis capability. Usually that's going to, at minimum, just be a search, but mostly with most of these tools, you'll also get the ability to do things like pivot, perform simple statistics, aggregations, and so on. So that is the log aggregator category. Beyond that, we also have the general analysis category. These are sets of tools that can be used to analyze basically any form of data if you get it into a somewhat generic format. And when I say generic, I mean something like a CSV, comma separated value, a simple spreadsheet-like format, maybe JSON or XML, just a common data format, and most of these tools can analyze them in some way or another. Kind of the granddaddy of all the analysis tools is probably Excel, right? Many of us have used Excel, and while it doesn't scale up to really large data sets, I would say that most data analysis tools are essentially trying to recreate something that already exists in Excel, and it's a great tool, and there's no shame for pulling it out and using it when you think that can be of value to you. Of course, along with that, we have command line utilities, things like sort or BC or awk, sed, grep, things that are available on the Linux or Windows command line. And we also have scripting languages, right? PowerShell on the Windows side, Python, which is more platform independent. The ability to write simple scripts to perform data transformation or analysis, incredibly powerful, and we consider those amongst the realm of general analysis tools. In the PDF, I'll list some of my favorites. I'll list my favorite scripting languages to focus on if you're focused on threat hunting, and I'll provide a list of command line tools and utilities that I think you really need to get good at to become a better threat hunter and better at the general analysis capability. Finally, we have the last category, which is specialized analysis. And when I say specialized analysis, we're talking about tools that are specifically designed to analyze unique types of data or do very complex actions on data. Now, some of these are going to be free and open source. Some of them are going to be commercial. On the free open source side, we have something like Wireshark, which is designed exclusively around packet capture analysis. You can actually collect data with it, but for our purposes, mostly we'll be analyzing data with it, performing filters, doing searching, basic statistics, creating charts and graphs. Wireshark will do all that specifically tied to packet capture. Now, there are commercial tools that will also do similar things for packet capture, but Wireshark's just an example here. Volatility is another example. It's focused on memory data, parsing and analyzing memory data. So that's what we talk about when we say specialized analysis as it relates to specific data types. Same thing with Silk and so on. We also have commercial products. So Carbon Black here is an EDR tool, endpoint detection and response. It's focused on collecting information from endpoint hosts, allowing you to query that and perform analysis. We have things like Rita, which is a threat hunting tool. It'll parse individual types of logs and look for things like beaconing using various specific algorithms. And then we have something like Exabeam, which is a commercial tool, which is using kind of the machine learning, artificial intelligence based stuff to find deviations from baselines that it thinks you can't necessarily find on your own. So everything you see on this slide here is just an example of a hodgepodge of different examples. There are many things on this slide I do recommend, many things I do not. You will find my discrete explicit recommendations in the PDF. I know that's what many of you have been waiting to get to, and those are available in the PDF for you to look through and make your own judgments based upon the information I've provided there. I put this in the PDF, but I think it's important to state as well. I mostly try to recommend free open source tools because of accessibility, and not all of us have huge budgets to pay for the expensive stuff. But I know in some cases the expensive stuff is worth the money, or if you can afford it, you need something like that. For instance, in the log aggregator category, I think ELK's really great, but I also think if you can afford Splunk, for instance, it's really great too. So I recommend that in there. So I do recommend some commercial tools as well, but I also try to provide free recommendations too. The key thing that I think it's important is that I do not have any financial obligation or relationship with any of the commercial tools I recommend. I think if I did, then that would diminish the value of the recommendation. So I want to be clear on that every commercial tool I've recommended, I don't have a financial obligation to do so. Want to be very clear on that fact. So take a look at that PDF, consider the tools that are there for you. Again, a hunter to some degree is only as good as their tool belt. Even if you master all the skills in this course, you're going to need tools to manifest your action. So these are going to be my recommendations for that. So when you combine the recommendations for tools with data, you should be able to get a better sense of what you need to really enable your hunting processes from those perspectives.